Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it 1 minute or so before we get officially started. We'll let you all connect with your audio, and then we'll get going shortly. Welcome. All right. So welcome, everyone, to the 2024 OVS VAP Training Center webinar. OVS presents How Would You Help? Today's webinar is Community Care for Survivors. So I am Blake Cush. I'm the Training and Outreach Unit Chief here at OVS. And as you can see on our screen, our Acting Director, John Watson, is also here. He's going to offer a few opening remarks shortly. In the meantime, I'm going to cover just a little webinar housekeeping like we usually do. We have made ASL and CART interpretation services available for today's training. Spotlighting our ASL interpreters can be done at the bottom of your Zoom window. There's a globe icon that'll pop them open. And then captioning can also be turned on at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see an icon, you can hit the ellipses and that'll pop out caption options for you. So a special shout out to Leah, Stephanie, and Erin for helping with our interpretation services today. We hope that you'll get the most out of today's training opportunity, but should you want to revisit what was covered, this webinar is being recorded and we will publish it on our YouTube channel in the coming days. You don't have to remember the links for any of that. We're happy to share at the end of today's webinar. If not today, early tomorrow, you'll receive an email. Thank you for participating. And in that email, we'll include links to the recording and all sorts of other resources that we might have ready to share with you at that time too. You can access them also on our regular website too. And finally, when you do exit today's webinar, you'll be directed to an evaluation survey on the presentation. Take a couple minutes if you can. Please give us your feedback. It's no more than 2 or 3 minutes of your time. It's incredibly valuable. And what we do with that is both internally make changes for future trainings that can help make them more tailored to the needs that you've voiced, but also give that feedback directly to our trainers. So many of them do this quite often, and the feedback is incredibly helpful for them to improve offerings for the future as well. So please take some time at the end of today's webinar to do that. With that said, I'd like to officially turn things over to our Acting Director, John Watson.
Thank you, Blake. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. This is the third and final in our National Crime Victims' Rights Week themed program. The theme this year asks, how would you help? Options, services, and hope for crime survivors. This is a call to action to create safe environments for victims and survivors to share their experiences so they can be connected with the services that they need to help them heal. I am John Watson, Acting Director and Counsel. I'm only the temporary face of OVS. Once the governor's office makes their announcement about a new director, we will be sure to spread the word. As Blake mentioned, if you missed the first 2 webinars in the series, don't worry, they've been recorded. So you just need to visit the OVS YouTube webpage to view the recordings there. Today, we are pleased to have with us Lisa Good, the founder and coordinator of Urban Grief. As a founder, I cannot talk about Miss Good without talking about Urban Grief, and vice versa. Urban Grief is a community-based project which works to increase awareness about trauma, grief, and loss associated with exposure to violence. Urban Grief is Lisa Good. Lisa fights to eradicate violence, increase awareness about the traumatic impact resulting from the exposure to violence, and to break down the walls of isolation and fear by connecting community members with each other as both resources and for mutual support. Her educational and professional background all reflect her dedication to help those in need. We're thankful to have her here today. I'd also like to thank OVS's own dream team, Blake, Rachel, and our OVS Training and Outreach Unit for putting this series together and all the coordination they've done. With that, have a great afternoon. Thank you for your attention to this presentation, and I officially introduce Ms. Good.
Okay, good afternoon. I am so honored and privileged to be here this afternoon. I am very nervous, so bear with me. But really, I want to just can try today to really convey my heart about this work and about community care for survivors. And so I have these slides, but I also want you to, engage in the Q&A as well, so that we can have a real-time conversation in as much as possible in this webinar format. As John said in the introduction, my name is Lisa Good, and I'm the founder and director of Urban Grief. And one of the things that I really want to preface before I go into some of my presentation today is I really want to preface my presentation with understanding that in founding Urban Grief, it literally came because I saw the need for care in the community, that people were experiencing harm caused by violence, and they were in need of care. And in that context, that's how Urban Grief was birthed and born, right? And because of that, as a grassroots founder and startup, many years, I've been doing this work for like 20 years, 20 plus years now. But as a startup, I didn't have the luxury of understanding the framework around victimology, victim services, social work practice, organizational, like there was no organization backing, so to speak. It was myself and volunteers. And so a lot of what I have learned, although I have degrees, a lot of what I've learned when it comes to community care for survivors, I like to preface it by saying I got it in the mud. Literally, I got it in the mud. I got it from being a hotline volunteer with the sexual assault, Crime Victims and Sexual Assault Center here in Albany County for many, many years, and going to the emergency room and doing all of those things and taking hotline calls. I got it in the mud just by learning the ropes in terms of what was helpful for survivors and what was not helpful for survivors, and then translating that information into community work and community response. And so I'm going to share some of my slides with you, and I feel like I should have more, but I really want us to have some sort of interaction, and I want to try to convey why this is so, so important. And so let me just pause and share my screen. Okay. Okay. So the reason why I have this puzzle picture up here is because I really believe that community care is about putting the pieces together for survivors. And so Ubuntu is a South African word that means I am because we are. The community being a part of I am, and I am being a part of who the community is. It moves beyond individualism, and it leverages the power of community to help someone in distress. And so for me, I think that that kind of sums up the essence of the kind of community care that survivors really can grow, experience post-traumatic growth, and start to recover, heal, and even thrive. So I want to just give you a little bit of an overview. We're going to cover some definitions. I'm going to mention the needs of survivors. We're going to talk about the importance of community care, engaging in community care, and then some threats to care, barriers and layers. So what is community? The Latin derivative, com and munis, means together and servicing. Another definition is a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. And the service, with regard to the service, it's denoting a worker or resource designed to serve the people of a particular area. And so a lot of community care language is really in the public health sphere, where we see it references care that occurs outside of clinical settings, care that occurs outside of clinical settings. And now you see in the medical field that, you know, there's a push to really have models that center and include care beyond clinical settings. That means your hospitals, your doctor's offices, that kind of thing. Well, that really resonates with me because when we talk about providing community care, the kind of care that people need, that survivors really benefit from, is this care that goes beyond the clinical walls or the walls of our organizations and our institutions. And so why community? Community influences patterns of social interaction. Community provides social support, but community is not limited to proximity. It also includes shared identities, values, and a sense of, that should say collective responsibility. And so it's in the context of community that we can start to mitigate some of the harm that has been caused by violence and crime. So when it comes to community care for survivors, it's a holistic approach to supporting individuals who have experienced various forms of violence. And it involves creating a network of support within the community to respond to the needs of survivors, to promote healing, empowerment by mitigating the harm caused by violence through care. Here's a quote about healing and recovery. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story on the inside of you, by Maya Angelou. And so when we think about this care that we want to provide outside of our service settings, to me, it embodies a way of servicing and engaging with people that, one, make it safe for them to be where they are in their experience of trauma and loss and victimization, to be where they are, but also to make space and have capacity for the untold stories that they may carry on the inside of them. And so in conjunction with that is this idea of social support. And many of you may have heard this term a lot of time, often we use it all the time when it comes to, we're working with people. We're like, okay, well, who else do they have that can support them or who can help them. But I just wanted to delineate for, just the different types of social support. First of all, there is the emotional support, right? Those expressions of empathy, care, and trust. And, typically when we think about community care for survivors, we automatically just assume that it involves emotional support only, but it's so much more than emotional support. But emotional support is key in facilitating the well-being of survivors. And so emotional support, those expressions of empathy, care, and trust, become the bridge. They become the bridge into building rapport, trust, and a sense of safety, which oftentimes survivors have been robbed of. And so when we think about emotional support, it's not always about the response, right? It's about the presence. And I'll come back to that. The next one is instrumental support. That's the tangible aid and service. And I think that, whether you're a service provider or a community member, a friend, or a family member, the instrumental support, in my opinion, sometimes is the area where people are most comfortable. They're comfortable with the tangible aid and service. Tell me what I can do. Show me what I can do. And right in conjunction with that is the informational support, right? The advice, the guidance, or suggestions. And when it comes to the instrumental and informational support, that's the wheelhouse of, case managers and, other community resources that you might be linking individuals to. When you send someone for housing resources, or when you send someone to address their food insecurity, those are tangible aids, examples of tangible aid and service. When it comes to informational, when you're giving information about, the criminal justice proceedings or processes, or you're giving information and guidance about interacting with law enforcement, or navigating family court systems, or navigating family dynamics and relationship, all of those things. Most of us are typically comfortable in the area of instrumental and informational social support. And then the last one that I will mention is appraisal. And this is the information that can help with self-reflection. And when it comes to social support, in a community of care, if you think about this community of care has a continuum where service providers might focus more on instrumental and informational support. Therapeutic services and support might focus more on emotional support, right? Or appraisal forms of support. Ideally, we want to have this continuum of care where it's almost like a safety net that no matter which way we point survivors, when we talk about a continuum of care, that people are going to be able to experience a combination of these different types of social support. First starting, of course, in their social networks, but also extending beyond their social networks. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So here are some things that are threats to care, right? That when we talk about community care, right? And keep in mind, when I talk about community care, in my, the vision that I'm putting forth is this idea that we're moving out of this individualistic way of thinking about how we support survivors and into ways that we actually leverage all of the community when it comes to supporting survivors. And so when I think about this notion, there are some threats to care. And the first one that I've listed is the social determinants of health, right? This is the neighborhood and built environment. When we think about threats to care, many times we are asking survivors to recover or heal or engage in some sort of growth or find their resilience, their place of resilience, while living in areas or environments, built environments that don't support that goal. So one of the examples that is always resonates with me is, when we talk about shooting survivors, and when we talk about injured survivors in particularly, that, they go to the hospital and then they're released from the hospital without regard for their safety, and they have to return to that same neighborhood and that same built environment where the environment is part of what contributes to the violence and may have factored in to them being injured to begin with. And this kind of tethers right along with access to quality healthcare, that understanding that health disparities are real in our communities. And so from our seat, we can make assumptions that people, just because someone actually has a medical appointment and they actually attend that medical appointment and they come back with some sort of result, it doesn't mean that they got the best quality. And so when you talk about injured survivors, whether those injuries come from intimate partner violence, sexual violence, gun violence, other forms of interpersonal violence or injury, when you talk about access to quality health care, this becomes critical to their care. So going back to this idea of community of care, the community of care also includes our institutions. And so being able to access quality health care, if there is a barrier to healthcare, that's one, it's not accessible. And we know that in the rural parts of our state, access to healthcare is a challenge and an issue for many people. If we know that access to quality healthcare is a challenge because of health disparities and biases, right? We know these things. So it's important that when we look at this community of care, that we factor in our institutions in the healthcare aspect, or healthcare as an institution is a major system that can be a threat to care. And then there's the social and community context, right? And social and community context is important because we have to understand where people come from and where they are trying to thrive and rebuild their lives. There is a term, I know many times we hear the term cultural competency, but there's also a term that's used in public health called structural competency. And structural competency involves looking at the structural systems that impact the person and their ability to thrive and to grow and to develop. And certainly structural systems impact the care that people are able to receive. And so understanding this social and this community context, understanding the economic stability that survivors and instability that survivors are dealing with is critical to their care. And then the last is access to quality education. Now you say, why would I mention all of these different areas, right? Because they're all very different. But the reason I mention that is because when you think about the trajectory of healing and recovery for survivors, all of these different areas play a role in how they are able to heal. And so when we talk about creating community care, it's imperative that we not brush aside the political action that might be needed to improve neighborhoods and built environments. It's critical that we not brush aside the barriers that people may have to accessing quality healthcare, or the advocacy that they might need in order to get the actual care that is relevant to their physical or their mental health needs. And so when I think of this community of care, and I have this vision of all of these institutions being positioned and aware, not just trauma informed when it comes to the needs of survivors, but also trauma responsive, and taking up the call to action to actually be able to be a part of this continuum of hope and help that survivors so desperately need. Now, you know, what does that mean for me? What it means is that if I send someone to to get medical care because they've been injured, that when they come back to me, I don't have to, instead of working on the pieces of their victimization and those and the relevant aspects of that part of their life, it means that I don't have to spend time undoing the harm or processing the harm that they experienced while trying to access healthcare, while trying to stabilize economically. And so the social determinants of health really become threats to community care when they are not operating in a way that is life-giving or life-affirming, right? Another threat to care, and this ties right into the social determinants of health, are the unmet needs. Food insecurity, unstable or inadequate housing. The number one request that we get in terms of services, whether it's in the aftermath of homicide, whether it's intimate partner violence, it doesn't matter. The number one request that we get is the either food or assistance with housing, to find adequate or stable or safe housing. And so it's really, really hard for people to kind of focus in and lean into healing and recovery when they don't have their basic needs met. And so then the last one has a threat to care is racism and discrimination and implicit biases. And again, these are, you know, although people talk about it, they talk about it, they talk about it, they talk about it, it really is a threat to community care, because we can have services, we can have resources, we could have this coordinated continuum of care and service delivery that is customized for victims. That means that, and for survivors, it means that, you know, the providers, everybody, we have a shared language. It means that we're using shared tools like OVS compensation program. Like we understand shared processes, like, you know, what it means to go through the criminal justice system. Like we understand those different aspects of it. But if you don't have awareness of how racism and discrimination and implicit biases impact people with intersecting identities, then that becomes a threat to care, no matter how good intention you might be when it comes to providing that care. Okay. And so when you kind of take all of these pieces and you kind of put them together, I bring these up because when we talk about community care, yes, there are layers and levels. And so, you know, we have the level and layers of systems, right? And institutions and service providers, okay? And for many survivors, those are sometimes the first entities that they encounter if they make a report or if they disclose. But many times, especially when it's, you know, an act of public or community violence, or when it's a homicide, right? It's common knowledge, everybody knows, right? And so many times, you know, depending on the type of violence that a survivor has experienced, they can be bombarded with a lot of systems all at one time. And so when I talk about these threats to care, are really important for you to be knowledgeable about, because a lot of these threats are happening at some of these institutional levels, at some of these systemic levels, and at some of these service provider and organization levels. And intention does not negate impact. Intention does not negate impact. And so having this awareness allows you to engage with survivors from the institutional, systemic, and provider level with a level of competency that does not just embrace and include culture, but it also acknowledges and incorporates the knowledge about structures that are surrounding the survivors that we are trying to serve. And we factor that in when we're attempting to service their needs. And again, I just want to pause and just acknowledge the weight of what I'm saying, because I feel it in my body. I feel this visceral reaction. And as I put this information forth, it really, like Blake said, it really is the call to action. It's not, it's a point for you to self-reflect and look at the system, the institution, the organization that you are in, and asking yourself that through a trauma-informed lens, what would a trauma-responsive approach look like to addressing these threats of care? And what would it mean if we factored in the structural competency that is really needed to holistically care for the people who have been harmed by violence? And on the duality aspect of it, also acknowledging that many of us as service providers and workers in systems and institutions and organizations, that we are also experiencing these same threats to care, to our self-care, to our own well-being, because many of us who do this work are also survivors, that we're not exempt from these threats to care. So when I put this forth, I just want you to just really kind of hold that with some compassion, with some reflection and some compassion. Okay, all right, we're gonna take a breath. Okay, so going back to like this notion of support, right? And now that we have the threats to care, the question becomes, do they know that you support them? Like, do survivors know that you support them? And, you know, I was talking with the social work, the trauma therapist that's on my team yesterday, and we were talking about the support that we give versus the perception of support that is received. And it's very possible that you can be supporting people and doing, crossing all of the T's, dotting all of the I's, but if they don't perceive what you're doing as support, you might be supporting them, but it may not quite be resonating with them in a way that they see has support, if that makes sense. So there is a difference between real and perceived support. Perceived support is when survivors view you as available to provide functional support. Okay, when they view you as available to provide functional support. So although as a service provider, we might want to provide this functional support, but if the community at large doesn't perceive you as available to provide that functional support, then they're missing out on the care that could possibly be made available to them. Now you say, Lisa, how could it be if we have this program here, we have that program here, we have this program over here, we have all of these different entities that are working really, really hard to meet the needs of survivors. How is it possible that we're here to support, but they don't perceive us as being available to provide the functional support that they need? Well, one of the ways that occurs, in my opinion, is it occurs through access. How accessible are you, right? How accessible are you? And many times there is an issue of access. And so when we talk about perceived support, at the institutional or organizational level, the challenge becomes to engage in some conversations with some of the survivors that you serve and check in and say, how are we doing with the support that we're giving you? Do you feel, or do you believe, or are you experiencing the support that we are actually offering you? Like, what is their view on that? Because the difference between perception and real versus perceived support is that people can have real support available to them, but if their perception is that no support is available to them, that perception influences their levels of stress. It influences their levels of emotional distress. It influences their trauma symptoms. It plays so much into how they're able to actually heal and recover. I'm trying to think of a good example. So the example I think I'll use, I hope my mom won't mind. She's not watching today, but I hope she won't mind. So my mom is a caregiver to my nieces. My sister tragically died in 2021. And so my mom is the caregiver to these small little girls. And so, she's my mom. She doesn't necessarily listen to all the things I say because she's a mom. But anyway, one time we were at an event and it was for grief and it was to support the children. And we were in the caregiver session. And so I'm just kind of taking a back seat because I really want my mom to get all of what's being offered. And so I'm just kind of like sitting, in the background. And when it came to my mom's turn to speak, she said, I have no one to help me. And I thought I was going to slide to the ground. Me, I'm your daughter, Ma, I help. But in her mind, she did not perceive herself as having any support. Now, she has a community of supporters, but in that moment, for whatever reason, she did not perceive herself as having support. What I witnessed and observed is the amount of emotional distress that I saw on her face, that I saw in her body language. It was visceral. I could touch it. And of course, me being one of her supporters, I was a little bit hurt and a little bit offended. I'm not gonna lie, I was a lot hurt, a lot offended. I had to take a walk because in my head, I'm screaming, don't you see? How could you, like, what? This person does that, this person does this person does that. Well, what it comes down to is that perception really does influence the emotional state and well-being of the person who is in need of that support. And who are we as caregivers and as providers to negate that experience because it is offensive to our ego? Right? I'm talking about the community of care. And if we are the caregivers, whether we're in a professional role or a personal role or a community role, and those are the levels of care that survivors need, no matter what the role, then we can't afford to, if healing is going to take place and we are the facilitators and the hope bearers and the light givers to light the pathway on this journey of recovery and healing, then we can't afford to be offended. We can't afford to get lost in our feelings professionally, because what that turns into when we're working with people in the community as service providers is we passively aggressively punish them. I know probably most people will not admit that it's true, but I've seen it happen. I've experienced it. I've had other survivors experience it. And guess what? I've done it, not intentionally. And that's why it's important that we're aware of this, because it presents us with an opportunity. In that moment, I had an opportunity to look, hear, and listen. Look, hear, and listen to what was actually being said, to look and see, look at the cues. I'm looking at all of the cues, all of the body language, all of the nonverbal cues, all of the trauma, that is just moving through my mom's body. But to look, to listen, and hear, and hold that without centering myself. And that is the challenge, to hold that without centering yourself, but hold it as an opportunity to reflect and check in and say, okay, what would support look like to you? What would support look like to you? And then there is this received social support, which focuses on the quantity and the quality of support given, right? People are receiving support. They're getting the support that they need. And, you know, and they receive it as such, okay? And sometimes when we talk about quantity, that there can be people who need a lot of quantity, right? In order to feel and be supported. Whereas there are some people who need more quality. So it's not the number of times that you meet with them, it is the depth and the level of interaction and what they receive and how they benefit from that. I'll give you a great example. There are people that I only hear from on anniversaries of losses, anniversaries of their anniversary of their assaults, or anniversaries of their injuries. There are people that I only reach out to on those days, on those anniversaries, right? To check in, right? So if you were to talk with them, their perception of that support is that they have received social support, okay? And then there are people that's not enough. They need quantity and quality, okay? And when there is a mismatch between real versus perceived support and received support, when there is a mismatch in those areas, that people will often feel abandoned and neglected, okay? And for many survivors, this is an ongoing theme, this theme of abandonment and neglect. And so it's important that you check in with the people. Do they know that you support them? And understand, and I'm not going to talk about ACEs or adverse childhood experiences today, but to understand that a person's pre-existing history of trauma and emotional abandonment, neglect, all of the things that those foundational experiences affect their ability and affect their perception of support. And so sometimes when we're trying to build community around survivors, especially those who have complex trauma histories, that more often than not, there might be a gap between the real support that you're giving them in quantity and quality and their perception of the support that they're receiving. And so in that case, in order to stay anchored in our role as community caregivers, holders of hope and light for survivors, okay, that we can't center ourselves, but we use that as a point of reflection at the service level to determine, are there changes or how we do the work or how we can do the work better or differently, because many programs have limited resources, limited staff. There's only so many hours in a day, but that's where community comes in. And so outside of the institutions, right? When you are a community member, or you are a family member, or you are a friend, it's important that when you experience that eye-opening moment, like I did on that day with my mom, that you pause, you acknowledge what you're thinking and how you're feeling, but you don't stay stuck there, that you turn it, you reframe it, and you use it as an opportunity to engage in some self-reflection and self-evaluation. Okay, so let's go to the next thing. So I want to just talk for a few minutes about empathy. Part of empathy is an emotional response. It is a physiological component that involves the automatic and unconscious process of affect sharing or the mirroring of another person's actions. Now, empathy is our bread and butter, right? That in order to build rapport and connect, right, with survivors, that they need to experience us as empathetic. But here's the thing, that empathy starts with you, right? It starts with you being empathetic towards yourself. Because sometimes as caregivers, and again, those who are providing services at the institutional or organizational or community or familial or, friend, you're part of that social support network that people come to, or, whatever level you are at, what I find is that many times we are trying to give a depth and level of empathy to survivors that we don't even have for our own journeys and our own stories, and our own experiences. And I want to tell you firsthand that you will run into, and I'm sure many of you providers have had this experience, you will run into some situations and some stories that will like sap your empathy. Like you're like, whoa, like it is almost, it's so painful to empathize in that moment. And you can kind of tap out somewhat a little bit. You can kind of like get to a low, right? Where you're starting to enter into that range of vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue or burnout. But, in keeping that in mind, what I have found in my years of supervising, training, doing my own healing work, and just even navigating my own journey as a survivor, what I have found is sometimes the level of empathy that I have for myself is also the only level of empathy that I'm able to give. And I don't know how to say that any nicer. I don't know. There's probably a better way I could say it. I just can't find it right now. But I just know. And so what that looks like, oh man, okay. What that looks like, here's how I can see. I've supervised people who did not receive a lot of empathy in their survivor journey. Consequently, their inner critic, their sense of worthiness about, do they deserve to heal? Like all of the talk that comes, the shame, the guilt, all of the stuff that sometimes we can emotionally and psychologically embody, is hinged on, what we didn't get, right? And so here it is. This is just an example. Here it is. You're a survivor. You're working in this field, or you're working in some other community setting, or you're a family member, or you're a friend, and but you have your own journey and you have your own story, but you did not, you didn't receive a lot of empathy. Maybe you were told to shut up, get over it. It doesn't take all of that. You should be done with this by now. Let go and let God, forgive and forget. Why are you bringing up the past? Why are you still stuck in the past? You know, shut up, stop crying. You know, all of these kinds of things that kind of, you know, really impact our healing. Or I don't believe you, you're not telling the truth, you're making up stories. And so, you know, maybe over time you found a way to compartmentalize that. You know, you were able to make meaning out of it. That's the term in the literature. You're able to make meaning out of it. And you say, listen, I'm going to take, you know, all of this pain, all this trauma, all this hell that I went through, and I'm going to take it and I am going to make it mean something. And I'm going to use my experiences and I'm going to help other people. It is noble. It's a beautiful thing. And so that's the journey that many people start out on, right? But if you keep doing this work long enough, you will encounter people who will remind you of what you didn't get. They will mirror your story or your life journey to the degree that it is overwhelming you. You might be, you might feel, triggered, or you're gonna notice. That's the point I'm trying to make. You are going to notice. How you notice depends on you, and your experience. But you're gonna notice. And what I have witnessed over the years and what I have observed over the years is that if in your journey you have not learned to be empathetic towards yourself, when you encounter that person or those people, when you encounter them in a caring capacity, that you're not going to have as much empathy as they might need. And what that translates into when it comes to how you serve them is it translates into harshness. It translates into avoidance. It translates into being punitive with how you may, deliver your services. It may, translate into you, looking for every opportunity maybe to discontinue them in your service system. It can look different in a lot of ways, but know that it's there. And so that's why I said, it's important that as we think about the empathy that survivors need and the care that survivors need, that this is double-edged. It points back at us as well. And so empathy is one of those areas where we also need to be empathetic to ourselves and with ourselves. And that includes within our social networks, in our workplaces, in our families. That empathy is not just a notion and a concept. It literally is part of, it's like the fuel that makes community care possible. And it is the fuel that is necessary if we're going to move this care beyond our office hours, beyond the clinical settings, beyond our therapy rooms, beyond our case management sessions, beyond the meetings that we have with law enforcement or district attorney staff, and if hospitals. It has to be we have to embody it first for ourselves and has an extension to other people. So let's talk about the empathy gap. So I'm just going to pause for a minute. In terms of the empathy gap is defined as this breakdown or reduction in empathy, the ability, which is the person's ability to recognize, understand, and share in another person's journey. And I kind of was talking about, like, one of the things that contributes to the empathy gap is the challenges that you may have with just being empathetic towards yourself. But also, there are some other contributing factors to empathy. And the first one that I want to point out is bias. That oftentimes when we think about empathy, we're more empathetic towards some groups of people than we are others. We're more likely to be empathetic towards people who look like us, and who maybe come from the same backgrounds. Sometimes we might be more empathetic towards people who have similar stories to ours, or we might be more empathetic to people who are quote unquote cooperative, or they're responsive, or they are loosely use the word compliant, right? It's not I'm going to loosely use the word compliant. That they're following all the recommendations, right? They're a pleasure to work with, right? We might have some bias and we might prefer some of those folks. But the bias part of it is that when we see other people who don't look like us, who don't believe what we believe, don't have shared values and cultural norms like we have, don't identify in the same ways that we identify, that we might not be as empathetic. We're quicker to close the door on them. And this is especially true going back to the social determinants of health, right? There's a lot of information out there about, how implicit bias plays out in just the management of pain for Black and Brown people, right? There's perception that we can handle more pain. And so therefore, if someone who looks like me presents in great physical pain as a result of an injury, that pain is more likely to be dismissed or not properly managed. And so bias is a contributing factor. Let me give you an example of an empathy gap that an experience I had while accompanying a sexual assault survivor at the hospital. And this was a number of years ago. But it was recent enough to where it just still really sticks out to me, but it was a number of years ago, and I went to the hospital. This was a violent assault. The person that was assaulted was a woman. Her pronouns were she and her. And going through the process of, dealing with the same nurse and dealing with the police and all of the things that are happening in those moments. She was in excruciating pain as they began, the process, the medical part of the process. And I had to intervene multiple times in order for them to adjust what they were doing and to acknowledge her pain. The lack of gentleness, the dismissive tone, and disregard for, the sheer amount of bodily pain just at the touch of a hand, was quite disturbing and upsetting. And I had never seen that before in all of the years that I had been to the ER with a survivor of a sexual assault. And but this was also one of the rare times that I had been to the emergency room with a Black sexual assault survivor. And here it was, she did all of the things that we want survivors to do. We want them to, call the police. We want them to seek medical attention. We want them to be checked for injury. We want them to, do the compensation application, so that if they're, eligible for compensation, that process is in motion. We want them linked, to, the next juncture or leg of care, right? To be able to call back to the office on Monday or receive a call back on Monday from the office to check in on their well-being, to offer them therapy or whatever. But in that moment and after that, given the dismissal of this woman's pain, that once the physical examination was completed, she didn't want any services. She didn't want anything to do with any of it. And she was sent on her way, with no compassion, and so it took a lot of work in intervening. And so that's an example of, a firsthand example that I saw of an empathy gap in play. Another example had to do with a shooting victim in pain management, right? And the nurse kept putting the wound care vac, like dropping it in the injured area. And so the patient would scream, but then out in pain, but the patient was then also being labeled as hostile and abusive. But every time that nurse came into the room, there was great fear because the nurse was not responding to a pretty simple request of, please don't put that vac there. There's other places on the bed that you can put it. And so the indifference that was shown to this patient by the nursing staff, to include the nurse management, was disturbing. And so those are just two examples of like an empathy gap. And so my role in that place was, in those moments, was to kind of be a bridge to fill in the gaps where empathy was lacking. And so bias, implicit bias, is a real thing that can really cause an empathy gap. And the fallout from that is that survivors who are traumatized and desperately need services don't come in and get services. The next one is burnout. Burnout and compassion fatigue. Burnout and compassion fatigue will have you second guessing your whole professional life. But burnout can contribute, and compassion fatigue contribute to the empathy gap, because your cup is empty. Not only is your cup empty, it's dried out, right? And so when you find yourself, frustrated and irritated and agitated, and no amount of rest is helping you to recover and regain and re-engage at the level of empathy that is warranted for the survivors we serve, then that's a flag for you when for you to really step away, regroup, and engage in some self-care kinds of things. You can be compassionate and be exhausted as a result of your compassion and the caring that you are giving out. And so those are some contributing factors to the empathy gap. Let's see. Okay. So here it is. I'm not a sports fan per se. I don't really watch sports, but I love sports as metaphors. And this is one that I use often when it comes to serving grieving people, serving survivors, that in the beginning, when the crisis first happens, you know, like there are going to be people, right? And I call the people who are around you in those moments has social support, has sprinters, right? Sprinter relay. These are the people that they're going to be present early on. They might be the ones that are connecting you from, the hospital to the victim service provider, to the DA's office, to the clergy or faith-based entity, to the social worker, to the school counselor, right? Sprinters, relays. Sprinters are going to be moving quickly. So, depending on what kind of care Urban Grief is providing, sometimes we're in sprinter relay, right? If it's a homicide, we're in sprinter relay. Anybody that's worked with us from OVS, we're in sprinter relay. We're trying to get things done and make things happen and move on behalf of homicide co-victims. But sprinters, their races are shorter. They're there for a period of time and they pass it off. They pass it off. Now, when it comes to the community, creating this community of care, you got to know where you fit. Whether it's with your friends, whether it's with your family, you got to know like where you fit. Am I a sprinter or relay, sprinter relay? Am I that person in my organization or in my family or in my neighborhood or in my community? Am I that person who's able to like identify what needs to be done and help make it happen, right? But I've only trained for short runs. Like, my time with you is going to be limited. Okay, so sprinter relays, when it comes to community care and creating this community care, not everybody fits in the same place. Not every organization fits in the same place. And sometimes survivors miss out or on the care, or they fall through the holes in the continuum of care because sometimes they're mismatched. Like, I know what things we are good at, we're really proficient at, but then there are other things that I feel other organizations are better suited at doing because they've cultivated that level of that specific type of expertise over an extended period of time, and that is their wheelhouse. And so in that case, we function in a sprinter kind of relay situation that maybe we are the ones that have the rapport and we kind of relay it off to someone else, right? We're still there, okay? But we're handing it over, okay? And then there may be other organizations that are really good at certain things, that providing these ancillary resources that help address the social determinants of health in a survivor's life. And some of those organizations might be quick moving and they have quick decision processes. And then others may have very long decision-making processes. And so when we talk about this community and continuum of care, you got to know where you fit and how you fit. Because when you don't know where or how you fit, this can, put you in a position of survivors struggling with real, perceived, and received support. And we want them to be clear that our goal and our aim as community at every level is to be able to hold them, to be able to support them, and to be able to, journey with them. And so sprinters, right? And see. But then there are the marathon. They're the marathon runners. And, marathon runners train differently. They train for the long game. They are prepared to go the distance, okay? And these are the folks that are really good at providing care at all levels of the journey. And so, we have people that during the pandemic, upstate, we saw unprecedented levels of gun violence, as many areas of our state did. We saw high levels of gun violence, and other forms of violence, especially domestic violence and child abuse. There was a lot of violence that people experienced publicly and privately behind closed doors. And so there were people that we started working with all the way back in 2020, like late 2020, 2021, we still had a lot of violence going on here in upstate. And we've been in a marathon with them, right? We've been in a marathon with them, that the goal of healing and building resilience and recovery is a marathon. And so if you're not a marathon runner, don't get in that race, right? Know what your limitations are, because again, a lot of survivors have experienced harm from systems, institutions, organizations, families, because there was this mismatch. The intentions were good. But sometimes I tell my grievers all the time, listen, this person was a sprinter. They weren't meant to be with you the whole journey. And if you hit a crisis, your sprinter is going to show up again, and they're going to do what they do. They're going to do what they do to help support you. But if you expect your sprinter to become a marathoner and they haven't prepared and trained in that way, it can leave the person providing the care overwhelmed, and burned out and frustrated and helpless, because maybe what they're doing is not working, or maybe what they're doing is not being perceived as support, right? And they're struggling to not center themselves. So that's where supervision comes in. But it's important that you kind of know where you fit, right? So sometimes you're going to you're going to be in a marathon with survivors. And to me, when we talk about this continuum of care, I can envision it like has links, right? We have the institutions, right? If you could just envision, and I tried to find a picture that could convey this, but I couldn't. I probably should have had one generated in AI. But if you can envision, institutions that are meant to care in all of those domains of the social determinants of health, that the neighborhood and built environment is stable and well, that people have living wages that allow them to thrive and grow and take care of themselves and their families, that education is meaningful and produces desired results, that health care is equitable and accessible, right? But if you could just envision, I just envision that what if we sprinters and marathoners are the people that are in between those institutions, and has survivors move through that continuum, right? Based on what their needs are, that at every angle, they're experiencing some level of care. And that's why it's important to know where you fit, no matter what level you're at, community level, service provider, family member, friend, institution, system, know where you fit and do it well, but also be open to knowing and hearing the ouch from the survivors that we are caring for, has a ignition, a switch on the ignition to say, oh, let me turn that on and take a look over here. So in terms of supporting their journey, as with other forms of trauma, we ask the wrong question. Instead of asking what is wrong with them, we need to ask the grief trauma-informed question: what has happened to them? Tell me about your losses. Tell me about your life now. Tell me what your life was like before. But again, from an empathetic, not scripted way. I had someone tell me yesterday about all of the therapeutic encounters that they had had along their trauma and victimization journey. And it was just a casual conversation, but it was very eye-opening. And the conclusion that they came to was that maybe they needed care, but they had been dropped and harmed by so many other forms of care that they no longer really had hope that care was possible. And so, as hard as that was to hear, I had to listen to that from the lens of what's happening, what happened to them. This is a part of what happened to them. And we have to be open to that if we're going to be seen as supporting their journey. Tell me about your losses, right? Taking an air of curiosity and inquiry about what happened. And, you know, I'm not talking about the gory details. I'm talking about what happened. What are the parts that you want me to know about what happened to you, the person, the human being, that you are more than the experience that you have endured, but you, the human being, what's happening for you, not just in the past, but what is happening for you right now in this moment. And then in terms of supporting their journey, is to understand how trauma affects an individual, family, or community. And you must first understand that individual's life experiences and cultural background. And so, just because someone looks like you doesn't mean that you understand their journey. You have to be open to listening to their life experiences. And again, doing your due diligence as it relates to, cultural knowledge, but also, listening with that intent of learning for understanding about the different aspects of their cultural backgrounds. The next one is building trust. Building trust is that first step to creating healthy relationships and can significantly impact our outcomes, right? And so this empathy, this awareness of structures and threats to empathy and care really can change how you show up and help you to build rapport and trust with the people that you are trying to serve. So I'm sure that many of you have probably heard this, but what can be done to support and foster resilience? Offer choices. Loss and traumatic events involve loss of control and or chaos. Increase the level of support and encouragement. Provide a safe place for a conversation and identify existing natural supports. Now, I got to be honest with you right now. That some of the hardest part sometimes for the work that we do is that there are a lot of people who don't have existing natural supports. it's a painful reality, but there are a lot of people who don't have existing natural supports. And so when you are working with people to help them identify and you're trying to facilitate how we build out this community of care, and you're engaged in these conversations and interactions with the people that you serve, tread gently in the area of identifying natural supports. Just because, again, people have complex lived experiences, and our goal is never to do any additional harm. We don't want to do any additional harm, and we don't want to re-traumatize people. And sometimes in identifying, helping people to identify those existing natural supports, some of the questions or that we might ask, or some of the judgments and assumptions that we might make can actually cause harm to the people that we are trying to serve. Okay. So going back to trying to like link all of this together, right? In terms of this care, this community of support and care for survivors, is the recognition that, one, we don't do it alone. That's why it's called community, because we don't do it alone. But also in the crowd, of course, you see the person that's finishing, right? Remember, I told you about your marathoner. Those are going to be the people that they're going to persist with you through your journey as long as the survivor is willing, right? Because they have self-determination. They're the ones who are persisting with you through this journey. And so we have that marathoner, but here it is. It's not alone. Now, in every community of care, there's always going to be bystanders and onlookers. There's always going to be bystanders and onlookers, people who have outrage but no action. Okay, people who have moral outrage and no action, people who have a lot of feedback and a lot to say, but really they're not really contributing anything to the well-being of survivors. They're gonna, and sometimes in those onlookers or bystanders, they are also survivors, right? And so in being an onlooker or a bystander, they may want to contribute or be helpful in some way, but they're stuck, they're frozen, right? But also, with being a bystander and an onlooker, they may also have their judgments about the experiences of people who are survivors. They might have stereotypes about people who are survivors. I'll give you a very common stereotype is that, after someone is shot or killed, well, people don't say these kinds of things to me anymore because they're not sure what I might say in return. They don't say those kinds of things to me anymore, but many times, and I'm not even talking about like service, I'm just talking about like just in general conversation, they hear about a shooting and they were like, oh, what did they do? Or what were they doing that they got them, they quote unquote, these are not my words, they got themselves killed. And it's so troublesome to me. But one time, I'll give you a great example very quickly, because I want to have time for questions. But I want to give you this example. One time I was in a national meeting with moms, and all the moms in the room, their children had been murdered. And so as they went around the room and they did introductions, a couple of moms did it, but by the time they got to the third mom, like I my angst was on 1,000. And she started off by saying, yes, my son was killed, but he was a good boy. He was, and he wasn't. He wasn't involved in this. He wasn't involved in that. He was a good boy. He was trying to do this. He was trying to find a job. He was trying, and she started listing, but she prefaced the sharing of one of the most painful and traumatic moments of her entire life, the death of her son. She just unconsciously prefaced it with having to defend her son's humanity first by saying these things. And like I said, I interrupted her and I said, you know, listen, your son was a human being. He was your son. You, your family, his friends, his community loved him, and he was murdered. His humanity is enough. His humanity is enough. And so throughout the rest of that particular meeting, I kind of, just supported the moms, and it helped them to reframe what, in a different way to, but they have been cultivated by the media, the media, police, other people, all, and so, that's an example of a judgment, right? That bystanders may have that might, that's based on, a stereotype that impacts survivors, but it also puts a barrier to the care that they receive. All right. But the other thing that is in the crowd, and I wrote this down because I wanted to make sure I did not forget to say it, is the other thing in the crowd are encouragers, right? Because if you've ever been in a race at all, you did one of those 5Ks or whatever, Freihoppers run. If you've ever attended the New York City Marathon, if you've ever been in one of those races, the crowd encourages the runners to keep going. And so in every community, what I want you to do is to not focus on the stand, those who are just standing by the bystanders, and don't just focus on the onlookers, but listen for the encouragement, because in order to keep this care going and to continue to provide care for survivors, we need encouragement. And so going back to, we have the marathoner, we have the sprint relay, okay, but then we also have the crowd. And so in that crowd is community. You get to pick which community you bring in as a part of creating the continuum within your networks around care for survivors. The distance, right? This one went the distance, right? And it goes back to this marathoner who's in the crowd, the sprinter or the relay. And then as we consider and center survivor and their needs for safety, the physical safety, the emotional safety, and the psychological safety, these are all domains that you can start to identify within your sphere of service, within your sphere of influence. Where can we facilitate and build up safety for survivors? Where can we build up and improve emotional safety for survivors? Where and how can we build up and facilitate psychological safety for survivors? Because when we build up and facilitate this safety for survivors, now people can start to receive and have the care benefit their journey towards healing and recovery. And I can't emphasize that enough, but not only do survivors need safety, but caregivers need safety too, because this is hard work. And so as you consider these circles of care, I want you to also be assessing and looking at your physical safety, your emotional safety, your psychological safety, and where are the threats to care? Where are the threats to care? Because wherever there are threats to care, there are going to be threats to safety. And the more we can start to see that with intention, we can then begin to be positioned to be more proactive as opposed to reactive. Okay, so where can you start, right? Where can you start? You know, notification and disclosure. A lot of times people notify, they might have to notify the authorities, they make disclosures, but wherever, when notification and disclosure occurs, that is a great opportunity to start right out the gate with the care, with the identifying what the community of care is for that survivor. What we have found is that many people that we serve have what I call, and I believe it's in the literature, as poly-victimization kinds of experiences. So it may be that gun violence may have brought them to our door for services, but over time we create safety, that emotional safety, we tend to the physical safety needs, we create the psychological safety, we start to get more information, and so in those disclosures are additional opportunities to connect the dots in terms of the kind of care that people need and the care that they want, and understanding that sometimes the care that they want is not what we have available or is not found in systems, but how can we look out in our community to see who's doing what that may not address that particular issue one-on-one or head-on, but it is a service or a support or a resource that builds resiliency, or that it can be a container that can hold a person while they're putting some of these pieces back together again. Then the next one is help. Surveying the available people. And you remember I already said to, do that tenderly, right? Carefully, but surveying the available people. And, who's around? Like who, it takes time. And sometimes what I've learned, and I believe what my team has learned, is that people can start off saying that they don't have anybody, okay, like my mom was doing that day. But if you listen to them long enough, you'll hear names, you'll hear places, you'll hear entities or institutions that they have relationships with. And those are the protective factors that exist within a community that can support healing, and also this sense that has a survivor, my community got me. But sometimes we have to really dig in and just be patient and listen for that. And then there is gathering versus isolation. And that kind of goes back to the crowd, right? That crowds gather when things happen. They gather when things happen. And in the crowd, you'll have some sprinters, but they're not marathoners. You'll have all of the bystanders, you'll have all of the people, but there is a coming together. There is a coming together and understanding that when people gather, and we saw this in public spaces during the pandemic when, after George Floyd was killed, that people came out and even though they were out to protest this horrific act of violence, this horrific act of racial violence, because they were out in those moments, there was connection and support and the transmission of healing and encouragement and love and acts of kindness that people had been excluded from because of the pandemic. And for some people, they had been excluded from it prior to the pandemic. But in that moment, it was the urgency of the matter at hand that brought people down, brought people together, and caused them to just lay aside all stereotypes and all of the things to kind of come together for this one cause. And that's a part of community. There was community. And so you can start where there is gathering. So when gathering takes place for survivors, you can listen and start to engage. Who gathered? Who gathered? Where were the gatherings? Was it at a street vigil? Was it at the hospital bedside? Was it just a few people? Did your best friend come? Like, who gathered, right? Like, what does that look like? And so there's this tension between gathering versus isolation. But whether people are gathered, there's an opportunity there for us to build and say, oh, there's community here. How can we nurture and support that? Can we nurture and support that through information, psychoeducation? One of the tools that I created many years ago in partnership with Albany County was a tragedy brochure, because I was out in the community and I'm like, no, we need a piece of psychoeducation information that can be distributed to community members to give them information. And one of the ways that I've been able to help support people in the eye of the storm is to support the gathering. All of the people who are gathering because they're hurt over this incident or they're devastated over this tragedy. And by giving them information about some of the basic signs of trauma and traumatic stress and grief and the physical and the cognitive and the emotional and what things help and what things don't help, and using those as talking points. When you educate and support the gathering, sometimes you don't have to serve the survivor, because if you support and educate the gathering, they will take care of the survivors, right? And so there's benefits in the gathering. That's a place we can start. And then there's in isolation, right? When people are isolated because of their trauma or their experiences, how do we engage and reach for them, right? And we do it, we seek to do that in non-judgmental, but here's the thing, non-threatening ways, going back to that psychological safety. And being mindful of that in non-threatening ways, making sure that we are not reenacting harmful practices and policies that some of these folks may have experienced from previous institutions, organizations, faith communities, community groups, that we're not reenacting those kinds of practices, procedures, and whether they're written or unwritten, whatever, that we're not reenacting that and therefore re-traumatizing people who have been driven away from services or don't see services or support available to them, or has a viable option for them to receive care from. And then the last one is tending, present versus presence. And we can be present for people. We're doing the paperwork, we're going through, we're doing all of the things, we're checking all of the boxes. But in order for people to receive and experience authentic care that facilitates healing, and I won't go into this, but we know this from the therapeutic, therapy literature, right? About how important the therapeutic relationship is with the participant, right? We know that. And you say, well, I'm not a therapist. You don't have to be a therapist to establish a connection that has therapeutic value. And early in my work, I undervalued my work a lot because I didn't have a quote unquote title, because I didn't have this degree, I didn't have all of these things. But what I learned to understand and value and appreciate about my work was that I didn't need that to have therapeutic impact. Okay. And when we have communities of care, we are empowering people. We're empowering people, and we're through information and knowledge and modeling, we're empowering people to engage with people in ways that are meaningful, so that the people who are most harmed experience presence and not just someone who is present. And presence is when I show up with my whole self. And that requires that for myself as a practitioner, as a mom, as a wife, as a nana, as my mom's caregiver, as my dad's caregiver, as all of the things, right? In all of those different roles, I have to choose every day between present versus presence. And I only can choose presence when I am checked in and tapped in to my care network, which then enables and empowers me to be able to sustain and maintain the care network and the community of care that we're trying to build for survivors, with survivors, has survivors, building the thing that we need. And so in order for that to happen, we got to tend to people, but we also have to have an awareness of the difference between present and presence. And sometimes present is good enough because it gets the job done, but you can't stay there. That for people who really need, for people who are in the long game, they're in the marathon game, a marathon race for their healing, present is not going to be enough. They will need presence, and we can multiply the impact of our work if we move out of the four walls of our institutions and we begin to look in our social networks, starting in our personal social networks, and then spreading out into these other domains, and seeing where are the opportunities to create communities of care for survivors, because you have survivors in your family, among your friends, and you don't even know it. And I'm saying that it's time for us to open that conversation up, and so that we are tending at every level. But more importantly, we're also opening ourselves up the opportunity to be tended to. So I am going to stop there. This slide should have been up earlier, sorry. But I think I kind of covered these in terms of empathy, conveying empathy. It requires practice. Some workers think that they already act in empathetic ways, and they don't. Level 1, level 2. Level 1 is little or no awareness or understanding of the most obvious client feelings. Level 2 responds to the surface, what's being presented. Level 3 workers' verbal and nonverbal are interchangeable with the client's obvious expressions. Level 4 accurately identifies the implicit underlying feelings or aspects of the problem. That's where we want to be. We want to be at level 3 and level 4, but if you only equip for level 1 and level 2, some empathy is better than none. Start somewhere. Okay. All righty, and that is it. Let's check for questions. Someone asked if the PowerPoint could be made available. Yes, I can. I will make the PowerPoint available to you after I make sure there are no typos in it. I can make the PowerPoint available.
Yeah, and Lisa, once we have that, we'll email all of our attendees a copy or to the link of it. You're a rock star.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. This has been, I tried to convey my heart. I had so much information in my head. I was trying to put it all on the slides. I was really kind of like overwhelming myself, but I just really wanted to convey my heart to you all that we all can care. We all can care. And it's important that we take care, but we all can care. And it's not in, you know, it's not just in the walls. I think the public health sphere they have it right when they have shifted to include community care. And I think that has service providers, especially, you know, I hope that we can start to embrace that. And that's why, you know, as challenging as it is, you know, we try to see people whenever they're available. Like it can be a little crazy making some time for scheduling and working and all of that, but you know, it's been my vision that we not just be a traditional program. But again, it takes capacity because it's only a few of us and we're experiencing the toll of that. But the goal is to build out and expand this community care. I see somebody had their hand raised. What does that mean? Okay, someone asked for my contact information. Okay, you
Yes.
can email me at Elwood at
Stephanie, if you have a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and check in.
I was just going to ask about the PowerPoint as well. Thank you.
We got you. Stay tuned.
Okay.
see two more people raise their hand.
Another Stephanie. Go ahead.
Another Stephanie.
I love your sports references. They're always swimming in my head.
Oh, I can
I didn't know that. I didn't realize that you wanted me to do this.
huh?
Am I supposed to be speaking?
Yeah,
Am
we
I supposed to
unmuted
be
you, Stephanie.
speaking
Go
right
ahead.
now? I'm breaking up. Hi, thank you so much. That was magnificent. It was wonderful. Several back-to-back situations of extraordinary domestic violence, families who have been victims of gun violence. So there's a lot of work at being empathetic and at the same time helping them to the next step and reading where they're coming from. So I want to thank you for the presentation. I think it will help us a great deal.
Thank you, Stephanie. Looks like hands are lowered and we're losing a few people. So I just want to thank you, Lisa. This was wonderful. I appreciate your time today for joining us, and we'll make everything available to everyone after the fact as well. So stay tuned for an eval link and all that. But this was wonderful. You're amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm very humbled and I'm grateful to share things I kind of talk about all the time, and like just never thought to put in a presentation. It was a little, but it's definitely yeah, that's what's definitely meaningful to me. So I need to go and take a nice long walk really quick before my 4 o'clock comes in. But thank you, and I guess I'll talk to you offline.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.